The room was electric with tension, the kind that crackles before a storm. Cameras panned across the crowd, lenses hungry for spectacle, as the man at the podium leaned in with a theatrical pause. Then, in a voice dripping with bravado, he delivered the line that would ricochet across the nation. Antifa is a terrorist organization. Gasps cut through the chamber. Supporters erupted into applause, fists pumped, chants swelled in rhythm. For a moment, it felt less like a press conference and more like a rallying cry from a general preparing for war. The word terrorist echoed, replayed instantly across living rooms, offices, and phones, a single label carrying the weight of fear, stigma, and division. Trump's expression hardened with self-satisfaction, his chest rising like a conquering figure who believed he had just defined the enemy. The lights glared brighter on his face, catching the unmistakable smirk of a man certain of his dominance. But beyond the frenzy, millions at home felt their stomachs turn. The cameras, still rolling, captured every syllable, every flash of arrogance. This wasn't just politics. It was a moment designed to brand dissent itself as a crime. And yet, as the clamor rose, a different kind of silence began to form, the kind that waits, expectant, for a counterpoint. Because in the middle of the chaos, one calm voice would slice through the noise and leave him speechless. Trump's declaration wasn't just another headline in the constant churn of political theater. By branding Antifa as terrorists, he wasn't talking about a defined group with leaders or an army. He was talking about an idea, the idea of standing up to fascism, of confronting authoritarianism head-on, and in that moment, he sought to transform dissent into danger, protest into crime, opposition into something worthy of punishment. History has seen this before. Leaders who fear losing their grip on power have always reached for the bluntest of tools, labels that instill fear. In the 20th century, critics were branded subversives or enemies of the state. In other eras, immigrants were painted as invaders, civil rights activists smeared as agitators, even patriots who questioned war were cast as traitors. Each time, the tactic was the same: silence voices by making them terrifying. And now in that press room, with every microphone live and every camera humming, Trump was pulling the same lever. It wasn't just a word. It was an attempt to reshape the national conversation, to blur the line between peaceful protester and violent enemy. But here's the twist. Fear doesn't always land the way it's intended. Sometimes, a single voice can puncture the balloon of intimidation. Somewhere in that same chamber, a young congresswoman sat watching, her presence quiet but charged, like a fuse waiting to be lit. She had seen fear used as a weapon before, against immigrants, against working people, against anyone who dared to imagine a fairer America. The nation could feel it too. Phones buzzed, clips went viral within minutes, hashtags swirled. People weren't just listening to Trump's words. They were waiting for the counterbalance, the rebuttal, the moment of courage. Viewers across America braced themselves. What would she say? Donald Trump had long mastered the art of branding his opponents with simple, stinging labels. To him, politics was less about policy and more about spectacle, about finding a word sharp enough to stick. The press became fake news. Immigrants were cast as invaders. Political rivals were reduced to nicknames that dripped with mockery. Every time he spoke, he reached for words that turned people into caricatures, complexity into slogans, and dissent into danger. And the formula worked, for a time. Crowds roared when he mocked reporters, laughing as he waved away questions with disdain. His base cheered when he painted immigrants as a threat to jobs, safety, and culture. He wrapped his rhetoric in the language of freedom, yet his every move was to silence, to intimidate, to narrow the scope of who belonged. This contradiction became his signature. He stood before the nation declaring himself a champion of the First Amendment, while at the same time demanding that protesters be arrested, journalists be sued, and critics be shamed. To Trump, freedom meant the freedom to agree with him, and anyone outside that circle was branded an enemy. Arrogance became the fuel behind it all. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he could bend reality itself through repetition. Say it loud enough, say it often enough, and the label would stick. His disdain for critics wasn't subtle. It was broadcast. The curled lip, the dismissive hand wave, the booming put-downs, all designed to humiliate. And humiliation for Trump was not a byproduct, it was the goal. But arrogance has a flaw. It blinds the wielder. Each insult emboldened him, each cheer reinforced his belief that he could never be touched. Overconfidence hardened into habit. He came to believe that no opponent could withstand the weight of his words, that every critic would buckle under the pressure of his branding. What he didn't anticipate was the power of composure. For every insult hurled, there existed the possibility of a response that didn't mirror his anger, but disarmed it. His strategy thrived on chaos, on opponents who fought fire with fire and lost themselves in the blaze. But what happens when the person across from you refuses to play the game? Trump in that moment couldn't see it coming. He was too certain, too wrapped in his own performance, too convinced that the show belonged only to him. And that blind spot, that very overconfidence, would soon set the stage for his unraveling. Before the cameras ever found her in the halls of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was just another daughter of the Bronx, raised in a working-class family that knew struggle as intimately as breath. She grew up between two worlds, the modest apartments of her neighborhood and the long commute her parents made to give her access to better schools. From an early age, she saw the quiet dignity of sacrifice, her mother cleaning houses, her father working long hours, both pushing so their daughter might have more than they did. When her father passed away while she was still in college, the weight of responsibility pressed down fast and hard. Bills had to be paid, family had to be supported, and dreams had to be balanced with survival. She stepped behind the bar to keep her household afloat, pouring drinks for Wall Street types by day and organizing for justice by night. Those years of tending bar weren't just a job. They were training. She learned to listen, to read a room, to hold her ground when arrogance leaned across the counter. It was there she developed a calmness forged not in privilege but in resilience. That calmness would become her armor in politics. Where others might meet insults with rage, she met them with precision. When opponents underestimated her, assuming a young Latina from the Bronx couldn't possibly match them in intellect, she disarmed them with facts delivered like poetry. Time and again, the more they raised their voices, the steadier hers became. Authenticity was her secret weapon. She never pretended to be anything other than what she was, the product of sacrifice, of grit, of neighborhoods too often ignored. In a world of rehearsed sound bites and manufactured images, her unpolished honesty felt revolutionary. Supporters saw themselves reflected in her. Immigrants, working-class families, young people told their voices didn't matter. And critics? They found themselves unsettled by a presence that didn't fit the usual script. Every victory she achieved was a reminder that the American dream wasn't just a slogan, it was alive in her journey. She embodied the idea that dignity could rise from struggle, that intellect could come from lived experience, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to speak anyway. So when Trump thundered at his podium, branding dissenters as terrorists, AOC wasn't intimidated. She had already faced storms that would have crushed others. The loss of her father, the grind of survival, the skepticism of a political establishment that laughed at her candidacy before she proved them wrong. Calmness was her strength, intellect her compass, authenticity her power. And as the cameras turned, as the nation leaned in, her voice began to rise above the noise. In this showdown, her voice would echo far beyond the chamber. The words hadn't cooled in the air before Trump struck again. He leaned back into the microphone, repeating the label with relish, each syllable hammered like a gavel. Antifa is a terrorist organization, he boomed once more, louder, sharper, as if volume alone could seal the decree into fact. His supporters roared their approval, the sound swelling like a wave crashing against the walls of the chamber. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled, and the entire scene teetered on the edge of theater. Trump thrived in it, feeding off the energy of a crowd that rewarded every punchline, every insult, every line drawn in black and white. He basked in the applause, convinced that his declaration was unassailable, that no one would dare challenge him in this moment of bluster. But politics is rarely so simple. For every cheer inside the room, there were millions outside watching with clenched jaws, scrolling through headlines on their phones, waiting, almost pleading, for someone to cut through the noise. The tension wasn't just in the chamber, it was in living rooms across America, in classrooms, in break rooms, in places where ordinary people recognized the danger in turning protest into terrorism. The cameras knew where to turn. Slowly, inexorably, their lenses shifted from the podium to a young congresswoman seated calmly in the crowd. While Trump thundered, she remained still, her composure almost jarring against the chaos around her. Her eyes didn't flinch, her hands didn't fidget. She simply waited, as though she had been preparing for this exact moment. The contrast sharpened with every second. On one side, arrogance, a man raising his voice to drown out opposition, pounding his chest to project strength. On the other, composure, a woman whose strength came not from volume, but from steadiness, from the quiet power of conviction. The air thickened with anticipation. Journalists leaned forward, sensing the shift. The crowd's cheers faltered as the weight of expectation pressed down. Trump, oblivious, continued to revel in his performance, unaware that the spotlight had already begun to move. Then came the pause, a silence that stretched across the room, across television screens, across the country. The moment had arrived. With the world watching, she began to speak. Her voice did not rise above the noise. It didn't need to. Calm, steady, deliberate, it slipped into the chamber like a scalpel cutting through armor. "Mr. President, with all due respect," she began, each word measured. "You do not have the authority to declare entire movements of American citizens as terrorists." The crowd stilled. A murmur rippled across the press row, pens hovering over notepads, waiting to capture every syllable. She continued, her tone unwavering. "The Constitution is clear. Terrorist designations belong to organizations defined by law, not to loose collectives of citizens exercising their right to protest. To collapse those distinctions is not just careless, it is dangerous." Trump shifted behind the podium, lips tightening, his usual grin evaporating. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but the silence in the chamber seemed to hold him in check. She pressed on, layering her logic. "If we allow leaders to wield fear as a weapon, to label dissent as terror, then we erase the very freedoms we claim to protect. Today it is Antifa, tomorrow it could be labor unions. Next week it could be journalists, teachers, or anyone who dares to disagree." The audience held its breath. The power of her words wasn't in their volume, but in their truth, spoken plainly, undeniable. Then she pivoted, her voice softening into something almost personal. "Justice in this country has never been advanced by silence. From the abolitionists to the suffragettes, from civil rights leaders to workers demanding fair pay, every leap forward came from those who stood up and refused to be told their courage was criminal." A beat passed. The chamber was so quiet you could hear the faint whir of the cameras adjusting focus. She straightened slightly, her gaze unblinking. "We cannot forget who we are. America was not built on fear of the people. It was built on the belief that government answers to them." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. For a moment, even Trump appeared caught off guard, his trademark interruptions swallowed by the gravity of her cadence. He fumbled with his notes, cleared his throat, but nothing came. The silence broke in murmurs, then a ripple of applause that swelled, unstoppable. Reporters glanced at one another, stunned. Staffers exchanged nervous looks, and outside the chamber, millions watching felt something ignite. Pride, vindication, hope. Trump tried once more to cut in, raising a hand, but the crowd's reaction drowned him out. The camera caught his jaw tightening, his bravado slipping into irritation. For a man who thrived on control of the stage, losing it was unbearable. But AOC was not finished. She leaned forward slightly, delivering her final blow with the cool certainty of someone who knew her words would outlive the moment. Mr. President, you can call people names. You can try to weaponize fear. But the truth is simple. Dissent is not terrorism. Protest is not a crime. And the people of this country will not surrender their voices to satisfy your insecurities. The chamber erupted. Applause thundered, cheers rose, and even those who had remained cautious found themselves swept into the force of her conviction. Phones lit up instantly, hashtags beginning to form before she had even stepped back. Trump's face hardened, his fingers gripping the podium tighter. But the damage was done. His showman's stage had been stolen, his words eclipsed. She had taken his declaration and turned it into his defeat, and as her words echoed, clipped, replayed, immortalized, it became clear this was more than a rebuttal. It was a line etched in history, a mic drop moment that would define the clash for years to come. The words had barely finished echoing when the ripple began. Phones lit up across the country, timelines flooded with clips of the exchange, and within minutes, a storm of hashtags took flight. Dissent is not terror trended at lightning speed. Memes painted Trump's scowl against AOC's unshakable calm. Side-by-side screenshots turned into instant digital folklore. The red-faced president grasping for control, the poised congresswoman delivering history with surgical precision. Social media became a theater of its own. Twitter buzzed with praise, Instagram Reels replayed her mic drop moment again and again, and TikTok flooded with edits layering her words over swelling music. Young people who had grown up skeptical of politics suddenly found themselves inspired, sharing the clip like an anthem. Immigrants saw their struggles reflected in her dignity. Progressives felt, perhaps for the first time in months, that the tide could turn. By nightfall, late-night comedy hosts seized on the spectacle. One compared Trump's expression to a balloon slowly deflating. Another played the clip in slow motion, pausing on his attempt to interrupt only to highlight his falter. Laughter echoed from studio audiences, but beneath the humor was a sense of collective relief. That arrogance had finally been met with composure strong enough to withstand it. Morning shows and op-eds followed with equal fervor. Commentators parsed every line of her rebuttal, hailing it as a masterclass in restraint and conviction. Editorials described it as the moment a new generation's voice cemented its place in the national dialogue. Even those who disagreed politically were forced to admit her command of the room was undeniable. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down, as he always did. He tweeted furiously, calling her names, insisting that his declaration stood, trying to claw back control of the narrative. But the harder he pushed, the clearer his isolation became. The narrative had shifted, and he was no longer the one dictating it. In communities across the nation, something deeper took root. For working families, for immigrants, for young activists who had felt invisible, her calm defiance became a mirror of their own resilience. It wasn't just a political win, it was a cultural moment, a reminder that dignity could not be shouted down. And as the applause faded in the chamber but thundered across the country, one truth became unmistakable. The balance of power in the story had shifted. The world had seen her answer, and it could not be unseen. When the storm of applause finally ebbed, what remained was not just the memory of a verbal clash, but a truth that rang far deeper. AOC had done more than counter a declaration. She had reframed it, pulled it out of the realm of insult and into the arena of principle. Her answer was not simply to Trump, but to history itself. She reminded the nation that democracy is not sustained by scapegoating, nor preserved by silencing dissent. It is sustained by people who stand even when standing means facing ridicule, intimidation, or the full weight of power pressing down. Fear has always been the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, but dignity, calm, steady dignity, has always been the antidote. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, chaos, a voice raised to divide, to terrify, to control. On the other, composure, a voice that spoke not just to the moment, but to every American who had ever felt dismissed or demonized for daring to speak out. Her rebuttal became a lesson, one not written in textbooks but carried in the hearts of those who heard it. Truth can survive the loudest propaganda. Calm can withstand the fiercest bluster. And courage, spoken plainly, can outlast even the most powerful attempts at intimidation. In the days that followed, commentators would call it a turning point. Supporters would replay the clip until it became a rallying cry. But the real victory was quieter, subtler. It was the shift in belief that perhaps the future of America belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who steadied themselves and spoke with courage. Because the story of this country has never been written by fearmongers. It has been written by those who stood in defiance of them, who refused to be defined by labels meant to diminish. And in that chamber, in that moment, AOC showed that the arc of democracy bends not toward those who wield fear, but toward those who answer it with dignity. The future, she made clear, belongs to courage. Trump may have declared Antifa terror, but AOC's calm answer shut him down. In a single exchange, the clash between arrogance and dignity was laid bare for the world to see. One man tried to wield fear as a weapon. One woman chose to answer with truth. And in that contrast, America was reminded of the difference between bluster and bravery, between propaganda and principle. The lesson is clear. Democracy does not bend to those who shout the loudest. It endures because ordinary people, standing in their dignity, refuse to be silenced. This moment was never just about one declaration or one rebuttal. It was about who we are as a nation, a people who have always advanced not by scapegoating but by courage, not by fear, but by faith in one another. So if you believe dignity will always outshine arrogance, if you believe truth will always outlast propaganda, then let this story be more than a headline. Share it, carry it forward, subscribe and stand with us in lifting up the voices that speak for justice, for democracy, and for all of us. The story isn't over. It's ours to write together.